Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Mary Baker Eddy Library. My name is Leslie Pitts, and I'm the Executive Manager and President of the library. Thank you for joining us for our third program in the series Strength of Spirit, Engaging with Mary Baker Eddy 100 Years Later, where we look at the life of this woman who rose from humble beginnings to become a household name after she published a book that challenged the conventional scientific, theological, and medical thinking of her day. And each month of this centenary year, we're talking with those engaged in thinking and writing about her ideas. And they're doing it in different media: film, theatre, literature, journalism, to name just the first few programs. And throughout these conversations, we hope to unlock the breadth of her appeal to different audiences today. A century has passed since thousands flocked to hear her speak in Boston and Concord, New Hampshire. The library's mission is to provide opportunities for the public to get to know her once again. The path she forged and the conclusions she reached in a century not always comfortable with women of achievement remain relevant to many audiences today. Now, I hope you'll join us again next month when we have a number of activities planned throughout April. All of this will be on our website very soon, but on April the 6th, a new lobby exhibit titled Mary Baker Eddy, A Life of Service, will be planned for the lobby out here, and we hope you'll come back and visit us. You'll learn how Mary Baker Eddy contributed in some unexpected ways to her community. During school vacation week, April the 20th to the 23rd, we'll host a program called Make a Difference for children and families. Besides viewing the new exhibit, there'll be 4 activity stations to engage the visitor in learning how to make a difference for the planet we share, the community we live in, one-to-one with people we know best, and finally, a place to share how you're already making a difference. April the 29th, we are hosting an evening program called In Word and Deed, Public Service and the Press, which was inspired by the Christian Science Monitor series, People Making a Difference. We'll have David Scott, the Monitor's international editor, join us along with 2 individuals who single-handedly changed people's lives around them for the better. I also want to point out that if you've attended or you've watched on the web our events in January, February, and March, and your questions haven't been fully answered, whether they're about the library's centennial series or the programs themselves, the library will be hosting a web forum on Thursday, April the 8th at 2 p.m., when you can listen in live to the web and email in your questions to be answered by the guests on the program. So let your friends and family know who live outside of Boston. This is one way that we can make these programs come alive for those that can't be with us tonight. And our email has been really rising in the last few months, and our web hits, because we're noticing that people are downloading and looking at those programs. So all that information will be on the web very shortly. Well, tonight, our guest, Gillian Gill, and I share much in common, except that I don't write as well as she does. We both come from over the pond and now call this country home. We share similar memories of school life, can tell you about the game of cricket, and we enjoy a good cup of tea. But most importantly, I've enjoyed our shared appreciation for Mary Baker Eddy and for Gillian's insights into her life. A library friend of the library from California wrote recently about Gillian's biography. For 10 years, I resisted reading her book on Mary Baker Eddy. The black cover of the book looked so forbidding and foreboding. And then one day, about 6 months ago, I checked the book out and finally allowed myself to read it. I was so interested that I couldn't lay the book down. She explained each difficult situation she was facing with such compassion, did thorough research on the subject, and presented a healing exposition. I saw that Miss Gill had great affection and an appreciation for Mrs. Eddy and her healing work, and it showed throughout the book. I now treasure it as one of the best and most illuminating biographies of Mrs. Eddy ever written. So please join me in welcoming our guest, author Gillian Gill.
Well, hello everybody. I'm Jonathan Eder, Programs Manager here at the Mary Baker Eddy Library, and it really is a treat for all of us, and certainly for me, to have you here with us today, Gillian. I have to say, in the interest of full disclosure, I'm a huge fan of Gillian Gill and her work. You bring such scholarly rigor to everything you write, and yet at the same time it has this magical narrative flow that just keeps you engaged, and you feel you're on an intellectual and spiritual and life adventure as you're reading through your respective biographies. Today we're going to look at the full body of Gillian's biographical work, including the work that I think many of you are most familiar with, her biography of Mary Baker Eddy. But she's also written very profound and fascinating biographies on Agatha Christie, Florence Nightingale, and Queen Victoria, and her husband, Prince Albert. So it's going to be the full spectrum of Gillian's career as a biographer that we'll be discussing this evening. Just a few words about Gillian's background before we get started. Gillian began her career really as a literary critic. And she did that so well that people were interested to see what else she could do, and they encouraged her to move in the direction of biography. And as I said, she's written these 4 wonderful biographies. And now she's really moving in a different direction and is considering herself more as a family historian, someone who is looking at the question of the community and the family context of history. So it's just a wonderful career trajectory that you've had, and we're delighted to have you with us tonight. When I think of these 4 women individually, they are such icons, they are so huge. But if they were to be in a room together, the 4 of them, and I'll let your mind wrap around that just for a second. But what would draw them together? If they started talking, what would they find as their sort of common points of experience, of interest, the perspectives they would share?
Well, first of all, I want to say what an enormous pleasure it is to be here, to see so many friendly faces from, I fear, the distant past, and still recognizable. This is wonderful, and they recognized me. And just in this lovely space. This is just a treat for me. And of course, Jonathan is being entirely too nice. He is giving you this impression that I have moved in this marvelously thoughtful and scholarly direction. That is so far from the truth. However, let us for a moment conjure this picture of Agatha Christie, Mary Baker Eddy, Florence Nightingale, and Queen Victoria all in the same room together, and what they might talk about as being their commonalities. One of the things I think that they would definitely talk about is the problems of fame and the need to carve out a space for oneself where no one is watching you. Each of these women had a passion for achievement, a need to reach out beyond the domestic space and to find an audience, a public, to have influence in the world. And yet, each of them, when they had so achieved, discovered the price of that fame, of that influence, of that image. I think this is a very modern problem, which we are perhaps dealing with in a very different way. But for each of them, it was a shock to discover that in order to do what they wanted to do, to follow their dream, to achieve what they needed to achieve, in some ways to realize their aspirations, they had to give up so much. They had seen of what they could achieve. What they hadn't understood was the cost. The cost of becoming a public figure, becoming a property that could be merchandised, could be slandered, could be created without their permission or will, that they were not in charge of their lives once they stepped out, and that the whole question of a woman's place in the general marketplace, in the general culture, in the general political life, in the general religious sphere, all of those issues, in the literary life, the question of a woman taking part in those was always a highly controversial, highly contested, difficult one. And so I think this was a shock for all of them, and each of them, because they lived long lives, had to work out how they could, or tried to work out how they could manipulate the self that was outside and the self that was inside to achieve not just influence, but contentment, happiness, some degree of self-possession. And I think that they would have had an extraordinarily emotional response to each of their version of that problem. So the widow at Windsor would contemplate Mary Baker Eddy in her Concord retreat and think, you know, what have we in common? What have we in common? Florence Nightingale in her Mayfair apartment, communicating by notes with her people in the room 2 doors away. These women seeking to sort of both sequestrate themselves in order to get away from what they had in some sense created. It's a kind of Frankenstein's monster of the self that they have put out into the world. And I think that this is something that modern women also are having to deal with. And it's interesting to see how these particular women dealt with that issue.
You've said that you're now interested in going into the area of family history. And let's just go with this vision a little bit longer of the 4 of them together in the room. And they're talking to each other about their familial experience.
Yes.
And how it was a boon and how it was a bane, how it thwarted, how it helped, respectively, in all their lives. How would they report on family to one another?
Well, here, obviously their experiences are of enormous difference. I mean, Queen Victoria, mother of 9. Mary Baker Eddy, mother of 1 son. Agatha Christie, mother of 1 daughter. Florence Nightingale, never married, mother of none. Florence Nightingale deals with the whole issue of how to be a sexual woman by refusing sexuality, by refusing marriage, seeing that she, in order to fulfill what she considered to be her God-given mission, that she would have to give up the normal satisfactions of a woman's life, that it was incompatible with a mission to serve the world in terms that she developed it, of nurse, of sanitarian, as they call, public health worker, as organizer, lobbyist, etc., for public health causes. She conceived from a very early age, much to the dismay of her parents and her sister, that those things were incompatible with marriage. Queen Victoria knew from the get-go that she would have to try to produce heirs to the throne. This was part of her royal duty. It wasn't something that she in any way looked forward to, or understood, of course, because she had been kept totally unaware of what you might call the facts of life. So she enters marriage extraordinarily ignorant of what lies ahead of her, and bears 9 children with increasing pain, suffering, dread, none of which were irrational, because women in the 19th century regularly died in childbirth, or just soon after childbirth. So in some sense, she fulfilled her mandate by becoming a mother. She produced an heir to the throne. She produced the heir and the spare, and 2 more spares, as it turned out. She produced princesses to put out on the royal marriage market. She did all that. She also made her husband profoundly satisfied, because his aims were to be a patriarch, it doesn't seem any doubt, also to be a good father. So she solidified her marriage. She formed a family. She more than satisfied her dynastic ambitions at enormous cost to herself. And I think it's true to say that she is much closer and more loving, and she's a better grandmother than she ever was a mother. So when we compare that with Florence Nightingale, who's an exact contemporary of the great Queen, Florence, no children; Victoria, all those children. So they're sort of the 2 opposites. And then we have Agatha Christie and Mary Baker Eddy, each of whom have, in different ways, very great problems with their child. I don't have to remind you all of the extraordinary strife and challenge that was represented by Mary Baker Eddy's child, by her first marriage. And I think this is one of the areas where clearly the stereotype of Mary Baker Eddy was used as a weapon against her. The idea that this woman had abandoned her child was one of the biggest attacks made upon her, and the most profoundly wounding in the 19th century. So Mary Baker Eddy was not allowed, in a certain sense, to have any lasting relationship with her son. And boy, did she pay the price for that when it came to her last years. That son took his revenge in the most damaging and hurtful way that one can imagine. So Agatha Christie, a much more apparently friendly relationship. She has 1 child, but that child is is the daughter of the man whom she regarded to be the person she had loved most in her life, and the one who had betrayed her most viciously. And she perceived the child from birth almost as being what in Britain we used to call the spitting image of her father. So Christie, who has this extraordinarily close relationship with her mother, seeks to have a comparable relationship with her daughter, and it doesn't work because the daughter is not like her. And so that setup of mother, grandmother, and granddaughter is a very fraught one. But I talked earlier about Agatha Christie's deep need for privacy. All of this is kept strictly under wraps. But what I found interesting when I studied Christie was the number of times in her books that she examines the relationship between a powerful man or a powerful woman, powerful in the sense of being wealthy, having a fortune to leave, living a very, very affluent life, and their children and the spouses of children, and the way that it's the children who are always the actual murderers of the parent or the suspected movement, because they have every motive in the world to get rid of that parent. And I then thought about, and all of these children are totally dependent. They don't do anything in the world. When you look at Christie, in fact, her daughter never worked. Her son-in-law, once he married her daughter, never worked. They both lived on the Christie talent, on the Christie estate. So she was living the life that she portrayed in her novels. This isn't something that's often been remarked, but to me it was the way that she's working out the consequences to family relationships of children who have a powerful, rich, well-established parent and are totally dependent on that, have none of the achieving, the active, the creative brilliance of the parental generation, and how they see the parent and the kinds of stresses that that causes in a family group. Christie was very good at showing that. Well, in Mary Baker Eddy's case, we see it in life, right? We see it in life. The struggle for her fortune by her son was of a most vicious one. It did not end in her death. But I think in some ways, when she was exiled from Concord, that was almost a death blow that was given her by her own flesh and blood. So these would be the things that these women might discuss. And of course, Florence Nightingale, who's probably sort of the bitchiest of the four, would have sniffed and said, well, you know, just shows what you get into, basically. When you try and especially mix religious and spiritual goals with sexual and marital issues.
Yeah, just to be clear, that some of that damage that was brought to Mary Baker Eddy was very specific in terms of a lawsuit that,
Yes.
that her son George Glover was involved in, which purportedly was being brought in her behalf. It was called a next friend suit.
Right.
But in fact, it was a way to expose her, to defame her, and to really extract her fortune from her for various purposes.
And that term, next friends, when it's your worst enemy is posing as your next friend, that's a marvelous irony there, right? That he was her next friend in the sense that he was her kith, her closest biological kin, and yet so far away in every way from what she was as a real person. Yes.
Now, all of these women were distinct in terms of emerging into positions of real power, real influence, but in a time of male domination in virtually every sphere of life. What were their relations with men in a personal sense and in a general sense? What was their perspective, and how did they negotiate this very unique territory that they all in different ways were inhabiting?
Well, here it's interesting that Florence Nightingale, who didn't marry, was probably much closer to men than she was to women. I mean, women had an awfully hard time with her. Almost every woman who loved and helped her was, maybe this is a little harsh, but stabbed in the back by Florence in one way or another. Florence enjoyed male company. She didn't trust women. She didn't especially like women of her own class, the women who would expect to be closest to her. She despised her upbringing, and she thought that basically other women were worthless almost. She was a difficult woman, but she had very close relationships with men. In the case of Queen Victoria, of course, she adored her husband Albert. She hated Sir John Conroy. She had, I think Victoria loved men. This is one person who I think who's never been accused of any lesbian tendencies. She really did love men, and she liked male company much more than female company. Men were the excitement in her life, I would say. She didn't like her sons, of course, on the other hand. She didn't really like them at all, except maybe Leopold. She had some use for him. Victoria has been given a bad rap, I think. I don't deal with this in my book, but I will if I ever talk about Victoria's relationships with her daughters and her granddaughters, that she came to feel that marriage was a trap. She called motherhood, the shadow side of marriage. She sort of tells her daughter, who's gone off to Prussia, to a tragic life, and immediately starts bearing, a succession of, I think, 8 children. Basically, every time I now hear about a girl getting married, instead of sending her a wedding gift, I sort of feel like crying. And Victoria was very open to her daughter, not in public, was very open about this. So there's this strange juxtaposition between this intense feeling that basically women would be better off if they did not marry, a fear also of the sexual, what happens to a girl when she gets in the clutches of one of these dreadful men. And yet Victoria's own rapturous account in her diary, one of the rare pieces of the diary that was kept intact from the scissors of her daughter Beatrice, the scissors and the fire of her daughter Beatrice, we know that she herself had a rapturous experience on her wedding night and was passionately fond of her husband. And the whole rituals that we know about Queen Victoria, that she slept for a very long time with his shirt in her arms, that she had a marble hand of the prince made so she could hold it in bed. All those rituals of intense physical longing for this man. This is one of the great tragedies, but also one of the areas of the great Queen's life where I think we modern people really feel this was a real woman, very flawed in all kinds of ways, but a real living being. I have always suspected that Mrs. Eddy also really liked men. I say this in my book. I don't know whether this has gone down well with the Christian Science community. But this seems to me the reason why she married Daniel Patterson. I mean, why on earth, So, these are women who rely on women intensely to do so much in their lives, and yet, one has to say, their taste is for men, their taste is for male company, and they do well in the world of men. It's a paradox, I would say. And maybe this is where they're out of tune with today's women, who are, I think, much more inclined to support each other rather than to attack one another and to see each other as allies. Maybe it's a question of generation. In those days, women couldn't help one another very much. In order to achieve, you had to reach out to men. You had to be able to be good with men and women. I think that's the answer.
So we'll go back to the room and the women. They're together. What would they be asking each other? What would be the one question that each of them would want to ask the others?
Well, one thing I would point out that, of course, Florence Nightingale and Queen Victoria did meet on several occasions. They had conversations, and those are well documented. And they found a great deal to talk about. Mostly, if I was going to simplify very much, what would draw them together was this commitment to, and this sounds horrible, but to the common man. That's to say, not to the aristocracy, not to the court, or in Florence Nightingale's case, not to the literati, not to the cultural elite, not to the ruling class, bureaucratic class of Britain, the upper middle class into which Florence Nightingale was born, but to the man who couldn't vote at this point, for much of the reign, couldn't vote, didn't take part, who was always looked down upon as a brute, who was seen as cannon fodder. This was Florence and Queen Victoria's great need, is to reach out to those people and to make them feel that they were their primary concern, that in some sense the officer class could very well take care of themselves. It was the men in the ranks who needed to have a benign, and perhaps a benign female guardian, an angel, who would look out for them. That was very much what Florence Nightingale did on the field. But this is where Queen Victoria reached out to Florence and saw her as doing what she, Victoria, would have liked to do had she not been queen. I think that was a very, very important link between those two women. And there's a little memory of, the Queen wanted to give a small gift out of her own money, as it were, to, men of the ranks, men who were not officers during the Crimean War. And she was suggesting some few things, and one was, some eau de cologne. And Florence Nightingale says, no, that is not what they're looking for. And she was able to say that. I mean, it was through the chain of command. She wasn't directly at that point corresponding with the Queen. But the Queen took it very well. They felt that they were sisters in that regard. And of course, if we come to Florence Nightingale and Mary Baker Eddy, here we have, again, healing, health, all those issues. And they would have talked about, I'm sure, the relationship between faith and healing. They would have taken very, very different stances on it. But in the end, I think, both, the theologies were, in some ways, as far as I have understood them, which is not well, they had amazingly amount in common in how they regarded the relationship between the transcendental world and the material world. Both had this sense of there being, in Florence's, were just a curtain separating us from the transcendental world. That God was there in the room, unseen, but there. Both of them had that sense of the numinous in everyday life. And they would have found that in each other, I think. Christie in this group doesn't seem to fit in. And in some sense, she doesn't, because she's of another century, essentially. She's more of the 20th century than she was of the 19th. I mean, she's born in 1890. So she stands apart because she lives such a purely private life. And so where I think Christie would have interacted with the other three would be in their relationship to writing. And if you want, I can talk about that now.
Yes.
These are inveterate writers. I mean, these are women whose pens are almost like an extension of their hands, who need to write for all kinds of different reasons, and who spend hours every day writing, perhaps dictating at some point in their lives. They might have a secretary write. Florence Nightingale certainly had people who would take down what she wrote. I think Mrs. Eddy did too, didn't she? Mm-hmm. Yes. So, after they reach a certain status in life, shall we say, they have secretaries, they have recording machines, in Christie's case. But really, those two become extensions of their commitment to putting down on paper all kinds of things in all kinds of different ways, but feeling that if they had not been able to write, their lives would have been, in some sense, empty. In Christie's case, towards the end of her life, she's barely making any profit from her the books that she's writing. Taxes are taking it all away. And she says, why am I doing this in some sense? But she continues to write. Of course, her descendants have been profoundly grateful that she did, because they have certainly profited from buying all these extra books. But for herself, in person, it was clear to everybody, but perhaps herself, that, writing is what she did. What would she do if she were not writing? And it's in some sense, even in Christie, and I think if I give myself any credit here, it is for seeing what Christie got out of writing, not just the detective fiction, but the books that she wrote, the novels that she wrote under a pseudonym. So these women are using writing to connect with the world indirectly. So remember, I started off by talking about the need for primacy and the need for influence or fame, the need to be out there and yet in here, closed up, that extraordinary to and fro. Well, writing does that, if one's considering publication. Now, in the case of Queen Victoria, you don't think of her perhaps now as a published author, but to me it was quite interesting that this woman who was given a diary at the age of 13 and ordered to write down what she did every day, knowing that everything she did was going to be surveyed by her mother and her governess, and that everything would have to go through Sir John Conroy, who's the great tyrant of her life. So it was an entirely an exercise in power by her mother and Sir John Conroy. It was not a free expression exercise, and she wasn't even allowed to, every letter that she wrote was read, and she couldn't write anything freely. But the weird thing is that by the time she comes to the throne at 18, this habit of sitting down every day and writing what has happened to you, she couldn't get past it. And so for the rest of her life, every day, in the midst of all that she's doing, she sits down and writes every day in her diary. And this diary is, of course, extraordinarily valuable. And who locks it up? It's her servants, her personal servants. Nobody got to see that diary in her, which is actually extraordinary, because remember, these royal people are being spied on non-stop, and getting hold of the Queen's diary would have been such a massive coup that, the trust of the diary. So Victoria, however, at some point decides, hey, I think I'll start writing for publication. So she writes two volumes of My Scottish Diaries, which are a very pruned version of her diaries. Well, at least one assumes they're pruned, since the actual diaries don't exist anymore, because, as I say, Princess Beatrice burnt them all. So she publishes them, and of course they're a bestseller. Also, I discovered that, in all essence, the first volume of the biography of her husband, the Prince Consort, is essentially by Queen Victoria herself. And so she puts herself out as an author, and it gives her enormous pleasure. So this is a woman who apparently is writing 2,500 words a day, every day of her life. This is what's been estimated by those who have seen the complete archives of Queen Victoria. That's a lot of words. She moves from simply writing letters, writing memoranda, writing in her diary, to becoming a published author. That's a sort of smooth transition for her. And it's very much of her time. Florence Nightingale wrote constantly, and I have to say she's a terrible author. And most of what she wrote is really of interest to specialists. I mean, there's notes for nurses, of course, but she didn't publish much in her lifetime. And a lot of the things that were important that she wrote were never attributed to her, and are very difficult to distinguish now, notably the great reports that she wrote, especially in the immediate aftermath of the Crimean War, on the state of the Army's medical services. So those are sort of anonymous reports. And yet, this is again a woman who left a huge volume of writings, most of it unpublished, Now, of course, it is being brought out. The unpublished works of Florence Nightingale is in the process of being done by a Canadian scholar. But essentially, until very, very recently, there was the mass of work Florence Nightingale put down on paper was not published and wasn't intended to be seen by the public. Interestingly, of course, she has this hesitation, like Queen Victoria. Queen Victoria has this diary. She decides to leave Princess Beatrice, her youngest child, charge of this. So she sort of writes the diary. She doesn't destroy the diary in her lifetime, but she gives it to the next generation to decide what to do. Florence Nightingale had a strong desire to destroy all of her personal papers, but in the end, she too decides to allow the next generation, in her case it would be the children of cousins, to decide what to do with the mass of her personal papers. Now, it turns out when I did the research, that next generation decided that certain things should not indeed reach us. And so there was, again, a little bit like Princess Beatrice, a culling of the record. And of course, this is one of the sad things, because one always wishes that one had everything. But I've come to the conclusion that that almost never occurs, that there's always a culling. Now, when it comes to Mary Baker Eddy, here, the importance of writing is extraordinary, because this is the most important way in which she became the leader of a new religious sect in the 19th century. She understood the power of the printed word, and she decided to capitalize upon that power at a remarkably early stage in her development as a religious leader. This is rather extraordinary because, at this stage in American history, women could not go to the university, and she herself did not belong to a family that gave its girls a very, very extensive education. If you compare her with Margaret Fuller, or even with Louisa May Alcott, she did not receive a strong literary education. She was a writer who was struggling against so many handicaps. And of course, there's this whole issue of not writing just accounts. I mean, she could so easily have written accounts of her healings, for example. Those would have found a ready buyer, as it were, in the marketplace. She doesn't do that. What she sets out to do is to write foundational, philosophical, religious exposition of the deep ideas of her healing movement. And, that was a step into the unknown of a most extraordinary kind. And as we know, it took a long time for her to be recognized in that way. And so I think for her, probably, sitting down each day till the very end of her life and thinking again about science and health, amending, making more precise, moving forward. And so finding through writing what she thought and what she felt God was telling her, that this was a long, exhausting and exhaustive apprenticeship, of a literary apprenticeship that she went through. And I don't know that I can find a comparable apprenticeship. So writing, in the personal way, it's a way of keeping in touch. All of these women are exhausting letter writers, right? They flood the world with their letters. So keeping in touch, again, how do we keep in touch? We're closed up in our secret place, within our walls. But we reach out. Also, we reach out through our published works, but we also reach out through our letters. We keep in touch through letters. Queen Victoria was much easier with people, much more intimate with people who lived at a distance and with whom she corresponded. And similarly, Florence Nightingale literally cuts people off for perhaps 20 years of her life, deals with them by writing, does not speak to them, does not see them, does not have physical contact with them. And of course, no one can touch the Queen, right? You're not allowed to touch the Queen. You're not allowed to speak first to her. So intimacy really has to be established at a distance. So they're using letters as a way of reaching out to people whom they love and whom they need without actually being with them. And then, of course, there's the whole issue of using diaries to find out about themselves, to think through experience. I mean, it would be easy to call this therapeutic, but I don't want to use hip words like that, but a way of sorting out the self, of thinking about what are one's motives, what are one's emotions, how am I reacting to this, using the written word. Here is the pen, it's not the secretary, it's not the recording machine, to think about what is happening to me and to explore and perhaps to become wiser and more able to do then the reaching out through the printed word. It's very complicated, and I think it's wonderful. And this is where I think we're probably getting close to where we have to stop.
We're in good shape.
But one thing I wanted to say is all of these women were taught to read and write. This is not obvious, okay? They lived in cultures where women were given basic education. Yes, they didn't go to Oxford and Cambridge. They didn't go to Yale and Harvard. They couldn't be part of the business school or the law school or the medical school. That was closed to them. I mean, this is not true for Christie. She could have gone, but for various reasons, she was considered too stupid to go to school. I mean, this is so strange, right? How personal shyness can be interpreted as stupidity. And an unwillingness to speak can be interpreted as an inability to express. So, they didn't have advanced degrees, is what I'm saying, but they had the basics. They read, they wrote, because they could read, and I think very importantly for both Florence Nightingale and Mary Baker Eddy, they were able to get to the foundational texts of their culture and their religion through literacy. This is not true in all parts of the world today. You know, most of the illiterates in this world are female today, and there's a lot of them. And there is at least one religion where there is still this barrier between translating the foundational religious text into the common language. These women were of a culture that enabled them to do that. And that, given their God-given talents, their energies, their dreams, that very small amount of education and literacy enabled them to achieve. And I think that's where their example to the world, outside the United States, where women have essentially all the opportunities of men. But that's not true in most of the world today. These 19th century women show what you can do if you're just given a little bit. You can change the world.
Gillian, these 4 works represent really the last 20 years of your life. I believe, if I have it correct, you
more, I would say now. Sort of 1988, I stopped being a translator and being an academic, and I started thinking I'd like to write a book that someone would actually want to read.
Well, Christie...
So it's a long time.
Agatha
you
Christie,
can work it out.
Yeah, it was published in 1990, and then Mary Baker Eddy in 98, is that correct?
96, wasn't it?
Okay. 2004 for Nightingales, and then most recently 2009 for...
right, I'm very slow.
No, Some people, I'm still working on my first one, so. But
no graduate students.
But in thinking about these different experiences of digging into these lives and really sort of living with this material and this history, what kind of effect did it have on you in terms of the development of your own craft as a writer, and the development of your thought just about the world, and just upon you personally to get to know each of these individuals so intimately in a research and writing sense?
Well, you know, I do research in order to write. I think that's a big, important thing. Before I started to work on Agatha Christie, and before I brought that book out, I had done an immense amount of research. I researched all kinds of stuff, but I didn't write anything. And so a lot of what I was saying just now about, you know, the importance of writing in a woman's life, in some ways, of course, I'm talking about myself. I understand those things. I really do write and then say, that's what I think. And I get to, I think a lot better because I write so much. And I also find it hard to imagine a life now without writing. So all of that is a 30-year, almost half my life, when I've been doing that. Now, writing is a craft. I'm not a creative person. I have to work very hard at it. But one thing is, and all of the women we've been discussing, one thing they're also energetic. They do so much. They have such life force in them. They don't give up, you know. Those things in them, I sort of empathize with, and all of that put on paper for me to read and to give me that inspiration. I started, as you can tell, you know, I'm 67 years old now, so I started late in life, and you sort of think, oh my goodness, you know, is it over? Is this it?
Mary Baker Eddy may have had the same thought.
Yes, well, exactly. I mean, she's supremely. But you know, Florence Nightingale doesn't go to the Crimea till she's 30, was it 31? I can't remember exactly when her birthday fell. But you know, they were sort of old by that time, you know. A woman of 30 was like, no. You know, basically a dead duck. So, you know, I got a whole different view of what was possible. At the same time, of course, I'm choosing to write about women who didn't give up and, you know, who start publishing in their, you know, Christie starts publishing in her late 20s, who suffer reverses, who sort of give me an example of what can happen. So if you sort of are busy and try, and so I just keep, you know, pushing away at it. You know, it's one page at a time, and it doesn't get any easier. But I would say for myself, I get better. I mean, I write a lot better than I used to. And for those of you who are Christian Scientists, you might regret that I did Mary Baker Eddy's my second book, because I would have written a lot better book if I wrote it now. Because I've understood a lot more about this whole business. It's a long, painful process. But now, writing is in my blood, and I will only stop it when some terrible tragedy takes control of my head.
You know, you were talking about adversity and sort of the reversals that many of these women faced. What was it in their trajectory of their lives that really formed them? What were the seminal experiences that they overcame that made them the woman that they were and the achievers that they were?
Well, I'm going to be very nitpicky here. Seminal is a word I hesitate to use.
Perhaps not the what were the critical?
Well, you know, I'm just going to put forward one thing. And it's difficult. Doesn't work for Florence Nightingale, but certainly for Agatha Christie and for Mary Baker Eddy, and in a certain way for Queen Victoria, mother love. You know, what your mother gives you as a girl, that I think is so important. And, you know, we've said that I might possibly do my next book on mother-daughter, granddaughter relationships. And this is, you know, I remember when somebody suggested to me that I look at Mary Baker Eddy, and I read the first, you know, few pages of the great biography of Mrs. Eddy, and I thought, I don't have to read any more. I know that this is a woman I can deal with and say something about, because her mother is so important to her. And this mother is also someone who is obscure and hardly known. And in order to discover the mothers, you have to talk about the daughters. Now, in the terms of Queen Victoria, it's not at all obvious, because her mother, during her childhood, as you may know, was really, what shall I say, controlling to the point of abuse. So the Duchess of Kent was not, in Queen Victoria's childhood, at all a good mother, and they were not close. I mean, they were physically close in the sense that the girl was almost never out of her mother's presence and always slept in her mother's bedroom. But I believe that this mothering doesn't have to be biological. It can be given by a loving woman, and in that case it was Queen Victoria's governess, Baroness Leedson, a woman, I think, who has been vilified in the literature, and of whom I make something of a heroine. I think she gave the future queen an immense amount. Now, of course, we don't know very much about what she gave, because very little has been written about it. And in some ways, I deduce it from what Victoria became. I remember when I sent out an early version of my Queen Victoria early chapters, and was talking about the extraordinary burst onto the scene of Victoria, having lived this extremely controlled and difficult 18 years of childhood. And my friend said to me, but I don't understand why she was able to do so much. How did this girl become this great queen? And I thought, that's an awfully good question. And the only answer I could really come up with was that, in fact, her governess was her mother. I mean, she called her, apparently, mother in intimacy and in letters. That these two supported each other, and that Leedson gave to Victoria something that, in fact, royal relatives could not have given her. A sense of values. That sounds awful, but you know, the royal families of Europe were not known for their values. They were known for their debts. They were known for their promiscuity. They were known for their incestuous relationships. They were known for all kinds of bad things. They were known for massive child abuse. Queen Victoria is different from all those. She is different. And the only person I can see who could have taught her the things that she starts to do immediately when she becomes queen is Leedson, a middle-class woman, a Protestant, strict Protestant woman with an excellent educational background, and who wants her charge to be a great queen, and tells her that, and says at one point, it's one of the rare things I would rather have her evil than weak, or wicked than weak. I'd rather have her wicked than weak. So, you know, this influence of trying to see how female achievement is nourished by maternal encouragement, love, protection, and the freedom given. The freedom given. Now, obviously, fathers are important. I mean, Mary Baker Eddy's father was extremely important to her, and certainly Florence Nightingale's father was extremely important to her. But to me, this is one of the key things, that you have to have your sense of self nourished, as it were, ab ovo, by a loving, intelligent, caring mother figure, not necessarily your biological mother.
And these different women, in their own right, thought of themselves as mothers in that larger sense often.
Yes, and they're not necessarily great mothers themselves. They move on somehow. They're empowered. This is one of the things that I will be doing if I ever write this next book, is showing that someone who's very well mothered doesn't necessarily mother well herself. It doesn't necessarily get passed on because the new woman has got all these other things that she's been empowered to do. I mean, think of Mary Baker Eddy's mother, a woman of whom one knows so little. She's just regarded as a pattern of womanhood. And yet those few things that we know about her show us that she gave, in fact, to all three of her daughters, to some extent, the keys to the kingdom. And that, when Mrs. Eddy's mother dies, it is such a profound wound to her. And then her father's remarriage, and this whole idea of the interchangeability of women comes in, and how that affects these achieving women. It's very interesting, it's very complicated, and I haven't worked it out. And I, in fact, rather wish I hadn't got onto it. Right? Yeah.
Well, you can still work it out in this next book on grandmothers, mothers, and daughters. Well, thank you for sharing with us so much tonight and for really mothering us, in a sense, with your great...
that would be nice for me to think I had done that.
Oh, yes. Well, I would like to open it up to the rest of you now. We have a mic here in the middle of the room. So if you have a question for Gillian, please come up here to the mic, and we have about a half hour to take advantage of this resource.
Some year, not too many years ago, I had the privilege of hearing a lecture on, or a presentation on the fashionable Mary Baker Eddy. And it was, in the course of the lecture, the lecturer showed a picture of Mary Baker Eddy in her fashionable garb and a picture of Queen Victoria, and made the comment that whereas Victoria progressed with fashion up to a certain point, maybe it was age 40, and then froze, and he had the photographic proof to back up his thesis. Mary Baker Eddy continued to keep up with fashion. He wouldn't say she was a fashion maven, but she, her everything from her foundation garments, which he went into in some detail, to her headgear, kept abreast of fashion. What does that tell us? First, do you think it's true? And if it is true, what does it tell us about their different approaches to life?
Oh my. As far as I can tell, Mary Baker Eddy was extremely beautiful as a young woman. I mean, from the few memories that have been given, often, in hostile sources. This is why it's interesting. That men would, there's this one memoir of a gentleman said, I would go to church to gaze on Mary Baker. So a very beautiful woman who uses that, I think. I mean, I don't want to seem trivial here, but just think of how you build a movement from nothing. Well, it's very, very useful to be beautiful and charming. I think for a woman, it's perhaps essential. Now, Queen Victoria didn't have to be beautiful because she was born what she was. She got it by birth. In her case, very conscious of not being beautiful. And conscious of the fact that she will always be the person who's looked at in any room she enters. I mean, just think of that. Now, this is a very tiny person. She's probably about 4'11", inclined to put on weight. Some of us can really sympathize with that. She bears 9 children in 17 years. That's not sort of setting you up to keep your figure, should we say. Surrounded by women, the most beautiful women in the kingdom. Married to the man who was considered at one point to be the most handsome prince in Europe, in a family that on both sides was known for its good looks. I mean, George IV in old age was grotesque, but as a young man, he was considered to be an Apollo of princes. The Hanoverians were tall, handsome men. They weren't nice men, but they were very good-looking men until they destroyed it. So Victoria, terribly conscious of being small and dumpy, right? So it's a tough position to be in. And essentially, this is a woman who, of course, is dressed. I mean, she never has to do up a button, right? This is a woman who never has to do up a button. And of course, the dresses in those days were pretty much all buttoned or hooked or something. So she stands there every day, and people, you know, put everything on her and give her her handkerchief and her reticule and make sure her hat is straight. And she stands there, but she's not interested in it. She has no interest in clothes. And as a young woman, she does fairly well because she has a mother who is actually rather fashionable and who knows what looks good on her. And she has an auntie by marriage, Queen Louise of the Belgians. This is the wife of her uncle Leopold, who sends her Paris gowns. And Queen Louise was a French princess. So, and then she, as the first 2 years when she's queen, she has one of the most beautiful women in the kingdom, and rich also, as her Lady of the Robes. So she gets excellent fashion advice. But then she marries. And unfortunately, one of the areas that apparently Prince Albert took over was the choice of his wife's outfits. And I have read, I mean, this is hard to track down, but from the few reminiscences, you know, the royal entourage was not allowed to commit to paper, even in private letters, anything that happened in the royal household. So there's not actually a lot of information on this, but it does seem that it was the despair of Victoria's ladies that Prince Albert had the final say, and that his idea of what looked good on his wife was not, shall we say, everybody else's. And so during Albert's lifetime, there was a sort of two sides to Victoria. There was the court Victoria, where she would put on, you know, obviously her fairly good collection of jewels, and where she looked rather good because she had nice shoulders, she had a handsome bosom, and she was sort of, you know, had these. But remember, 9 pregnancies in 17 years, you know, it had to cover a lot, right? But you see her in the famous portraits by Winterhalter and Landseer. You see the idealized court version of Queen Victoria. But then there's the Victoria on vacation, shall we say, who's wearing these disastrous outfits. And, you know, when the Crystal Palace is on, she goes almost every week to visit the Crystal Palace with different groups of friends. Now, the first time she goes is to open it. And what does she wear? She wears this glorious pink outfit with this massive diamond and her tiara and the whole 9 yards, right? Incidentally, tempting would-be assassins to kill her. I mean, she's shining, right? Right there in an open carriage. But after that, she goes individually as just a visitor with friends. And people sort of looked at her and thought, I would never be seen dead wearing that, basically. That's to say she's sort of dressed down, way down, in those occasions. And then when she goes to Balmoral, you know, well, after Prince Albert's death, you know, we have this famous recorded remark by John Brown say, you know, you're not wearing that ratty old thing. I mean, even he was shocked by the, you know, the mud on her skirt and the general sort of disregard for, but she loved to be in Scotland and just sort of have, you know, plaid skirts and tweeds and all that. So she hated to get herself out. Now think of that problem for her, right? And so when we see her in old age, you know, going into the black, in some sense, this was, of course, mainly an expression of sorrow, but it was also a question of, you know, farewell to all that, you know, don't have to do that anymore. We'll just wear our black outfits. Nobody's going to look at us anymore. We have ceased to be an object of desire to the one person that we loved. So we don't have to try anymore. So we won't. And I'm the queen, and I can do exactly what I like.
Thank you very much for a very fascinating evening. And I'm going to try to squeeze maybe 3 questions into one. You wrote the Mary Baker Eddy biography as part of I think of a series of biographies.
The Radcliffe biography series,
yes.
which doesn't exist anymore.
And I wondered how you are able to continue, what underwrites your ability to continue writing biographies? How do you choose the subject of your biographies? And what do you see as the future of biographies, given the fact that with all of our electronic communications, we're no longer writing letters and other source materials?
Yes, awfully good question. Very, I mean, this is a subject for a whole lecture, not by me. One reason why I'm stuck as to what to do next is because I do think that biography has run its race in some ways. I find biographies intensely tedious, and so I'm pretty sure that other people find my biographies intensely tedious, so I think, why write them? That's why I've moved more into what I call family history, telling more of a story of generations. It's sort of becoming more like a soap opera, I guess, what I'm doing. Biography itself, in terms of sources, that, you would all be able to contribute to this, but I, in fact, through email and saving my email, and probably have a very, very, very big trove of papers that, unless my computer is wiped out, of course, you know, future generations could read. I'm sure they won't bother, but you know what I mean. It's there, and so important people are presumably doing all that. So I wouldn't be surprised if electronic media are preserving a lot. Now, you know, if it's bad, you know, in the old days people couldn't spell at all. You know, they just wrote down whatever came in, and nobody minded. Then we went through the whole thing. Everything has to be spelled and grammatical and carefully punctuated. But that's rather a short time in the history of literacy, I would say, that was true. Well, now we sort of don't bother about punctuation or grammar or everything. We're writing in these abbreviated forms. But I think that's going to be perfectly fine. Just as Pepys can be read, even though he didn't sort of spell things properly, we'll read what people are writing today. And I personally use email very much as I used to use letters that I put in the mail. I don't use Facebook. I'm not interested in speaking to the world at large, but I'm very interested in reaching out to friends, and the fact that they can receive it so fast is so marvelous. And as I say, I keep everything. So I am not actually depressed or gloomy about the source problem, but I could be quite wrong about that. And I think we're going to be writing biographies in a different way. I think they're going to be much more episodic. When they're coming out, that we won't necessarily be able to have 3 whole volumes on one life. I think that probably won't be working. But what we will have is that when we write something, other people can immediately contact us and say, no, you got that wrong. And so we'll get a much more accurate and pure record. So I'm kind of actually up on the future of biographical works, but maybe not in the form that we have seen them in the past.
Thank you for being with us this evening. It's really a privilege to be in your audience.
Well, it's my pleasure to be
Thank you.
here.
I'd like to make 3 quick points and then try to form a quick question. The history of President Richard Nixon's visit to China, and in a private visit with the chairman, not protocol meetings, talking policy decisions. It's reported that the chairman asked the president, 100 years from now, the political scientists of the world, who will they say was the most important president of the United States? And the president responded, saying, it'll be a tie between George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. And the chairman said, you're wrong. In 100 years from now, China will have 25% of all the political scientists in the world, and they will guarantee that the vote will be for Richard Nixon. Because he opened up China.
Oh, right.
That's the key point. Okay?
Yes.
Now, point number 2. In my understanding from the King James Version of the Bible, Christ Jesus did not say he would come back. He said, I go away, but I will send the Comforter, which will give you all the answers that you need. 3rd point, Mary Baker Eddy studied his life so closely, walked so closely in his footsteps, that she discovered the principle of what he was teaching. And in one short sentence, he said, the Comforter is divine science. So my question then, 100 years from now, historians such as yourself, is it possible that they will perceive that there is an enormous significance in what Mrs. Eddy discovered? And while you have told us about not only Mary Baker Eddy, but 3 other very important women in our history, is it possible 100 years from now we'll see a separation with Mrs. Eddy maybe elevating her importance in the world because of the enormous implications in the Christian world of what it means that the Comforter is already here?
Well, I think that this library is going to, in some sense, provide the answer to that, right? Because of the way that the library will be used to bring a printed book, Science and Health, into a new generation. I mean, we were talking just now about the future of biography, but here one could talk about the future of text itself and how we will read text. So just as in the 19th century, the great leap forward that Mary Baker Eddy took as a young woman, I mean, as a still struggling pre-power, I mean, the key thing to do was to have a book. That understanding in our generation could be, there has to be some other way of getting out that message, that in order for people to reach her, they will have to, there will have to be other ways of finding that book for people. And I think this library is attempting to do precisely that. And how it will work out, we cannot tell, but that is, I think, the work of everybody here.
Hi, could we go back for a minute to the future of biography? Because, first of all, I read your book, I read Mary Baker Eddy within the last couple of years, and absolutely loved it. I thought it set a new bar for me in terms of really excellent books. And as I was reading it, and shortly thereafter I read Miscellaneous Writings, Mrs. Eddy's Miscellaneous Writings all the way through. And when I was reading both books, what kept coming to me was, this would be fabulous as a mashup, basically. You know,
There's a new thing for you. Whoever thought of mashups, right?
Well, I mean, you were talking about being high on the future of biography, and I wondered from an author's point of view how you would view that. Something where, for example, you'd have, when you're talking about her, Mrs. Eddy's talk in Tremont Temple. I mean, I haven't read your other biographies. I'd love, the same concept would go for those, I think. But with biography in particular, you can take the reader to the places. You can go to the original source documents. You can go to show what the Massachusetts Metaphysical College looked like on Columbus Ave, 100 years ago, whatever. I think it would be absolutely thrilling. But I was curious from an author's point of view, what do you think of that concept?
I mean, I think that sounds great. I mean, I think it would have to be cut up, but there would be so many, I mean, the links, you're talking about links of various kinds. I mean, the problem with links is that
they take you off?
No, yes. I mean, they go infinitely out.
Okay. Right.
And so each reading experience is of indeterminate length. I mean, if you read a chapter of a book, given your own rhythm of reading and, how good a reading light you have and how much sort of you're going out late at night and things like that, you could pretty much know how much you're going to take. But once you start going off, you don't know how long it's going to take. And therefore, I think it's not so much that today people can't focus. I always get very disturbed when people say, oh, today nobody can read anything longer than 2 paragraphs and things like that. I mean, I don't know, maybe it's true, but what I think is that people think in different ways and that it is, in fact, much more reticulate. It's much more in a network. And it's an indeterminate network. It doesn't, it's not within the covers of a book. It's not just those pictures, those printed symbols on a page. It can go in all different kinds of ways, and that there is much more interactivity, not just between the links themselves, between you and the text. Now, modern literary theory sort of went to town on this whole idea that a text doesn't exist in isolation. It's not a book, it's not a tin that you open up and take out biscuits. It is a network. It's a relationship between you and this. And that when I read a book and you read a book, actually each of those books is different because each of us is bringing something else to it. And that's the nature of reading. And that authorship is a very weird and perhaps meaningless category, because authorship is part of this correspondence between reader. Well, once we bring in the web, everything gets all mixed up. And I, as a writer, it is true, give up my old authorship, in a sense. If you think of author as being in control, possessing, proprietor, all those, author is all those things. I no longer have autoritas over my product.
Well, you have the platform and you
yes,
run the community.
But what I am doing is, now how we all get paid for that is another matter.
We were just talking about this.
And this is the whole question of how do we get content in this current world, new content. How do we pay creative people to bother to put things down? And there, the mashup concept does get a little murky. I mean, I have to say, these people who just take chunks of other people's work and stick them all together, well, I could have done that. I can see it's a collage, it's interesting, but I sort of suspect that at some point somebody has to actually write something else. And how are they going to get paid for it? That's a huge issue. And everybody is dealing with it in every aspect of the publishing literary world.
It's true, but I hope that with your books and your new ones too, that would be a great way to do it. Anyway, thanks.
We'll buy them, Gillian.
I've always loved biographies, and I just love what you shared this evening about these wonderful women that you've chosen to write about. I didn't even hear about Mrs. Eddy until I was a grown-up and I'd come to America. I was wondering if you could share with us how you even found out about Mary Baker Eddy and what it was that intrigued you to do all that research and to spend so much time finding out about this woman, and what was different about when you started and when you ended, if there were some differences there in how you were looking at her.
You know, chance is, it's not entirely chance, but largely. I had been in touch with a woman called Lloyd Lawrence. She was the head of the Radcliffe Biography series. I'd written my Christie book. She had been interested in publishing it, but didn't in the end. But we kept in touch, and I was looking for a new subject, and she said, how about Mary Baker Eddy? And I mean, I have said this so many times, it's becoming legendary in my own lifetime. But I really do believe I said, you know, I really knew nothing. I'm not a Christian Scientist. I knew nothing about Christian Science. I had never visited the Christian Science campus, the center here, nothing. But I liked this woman, and I respected her, and she had a marvelous grasp of all the biographical subjects, which were sort of still available, as it were. So I hoofed down to the library, and as I've just said, I opened the first volume of this biography, which happened to be in the Lexington Library, and within 50 pages, I decided, stupidly, to take this on. And I've described this, you've read the book, I won't. Ignorance can be bliss. I did not, if I had had any idea of what I was taking on, I certainly would not have done it. I'll say that now. But I don't know, you know, chance is a funny idea, isn't it? What's chance? What is chance? Sometimes one takes on something, maybe this is the Freudian part of me, that there's a part of you that you don't know that is moving in some direction. And you seize upon something apparently serendipitously, but in fact, there's a deep connection. And you don't discover it until later. I don't know if that's all happened ever to you, but this happens quite a bit to me. And so no one would have chosen me to do that either. No one in the whole world. I had no qualifications for this book. I wasn't an historian. I knew nothing about American. I was, but in a certain way, that ignorance, that outsiderness, that coming to it new was the secret. That was it. And somewhat in the same way for Agatha Christie, I don't read detective fiction. I didn't read detective fiction. I came upon detective fiction sort of willy-nilly. I mean, it was silly that I should write about this. And, after I'd published my book, I would find myself in groups where people read 5 detective novels a week. and they would... And they knew it all, they were so into it. And here was I writing this book about, but again, it was because I didn't know anything about it that I said, hey, why is the most popular woman writer in the whole world looked down upon by almost everybody? What can be wrong with her that, surely she has to be given some credit for writing books that people like so much. Not just in one generation, generation after generation, nation by nation, this woman has to have something. So, I think I'm much more, if I have any creative side to me, and I'm not sure that it's when I meet something that I don't know about, and somehow it calls to me, and I find out about it, and the finding out enables me to write an interesting book where readers also, through me, find out. Yes?
That's beautiful, thank you. Yes.
Thanks, Gillian. Well, we have time for one more question. And
I was thinking about when you were saying that Mrs. Eddy talking about the fact that she didn't get a chance to mother a family. And I was thinking, in fact, in your book, you talk about her desire to have a family setting.
Yes.
And as kind of the explanation for why she adopted Foster Eddy. And the fact that she does create a kind of family. So I was thinking, in that sense,
yes,
maybe the fact that she had a feeling from her mother about how to have relationships did produce some, did flower in the family that she created at Pleasant View.
And I do think that, don't you, that those were, in some sense, that she had daughters?
Oh, yeah, and I mean, the fact that she felt so comfortable with them calling her mother, and that she signed so many of her letters, Mother in Israel. And I think it'd be hard to argue that that wasn't the case. And I even wonder, I guess I wanted to raise a question about her son's part in Next Friends, because I always wonder to what extent he was being used. No, I guess I wouldn't use the word vicious. Just maybe more suspicious of his daughter than. But in any case, just wanted to. I think he had perhaps good reason. I mean, he suspected that his mother wasn't being shown his letters, and he was right. And Fry, of course, had all kinds of reasons to think this is not as important as other things that were going on. So, he may have thought, oh, if only she would see my letters, she would certainly see me and loan me more money for another mine operation. But in any case.
And the fact that he was unable to write himself, right?
Yes. Yeah.
That he always has to employ an amanuensis.
Right.
That is, I'm talking about literacy. Well, he can't write to her.
Yes.
He can dictate to someone.
Well,
and as soon as you have that interposition of another person.
But he also didn't get a lot of things, like when he explained to someone that his mother ran something called mesmeric science. He really didn't get kind of what she was doing.
One thing this is not perhaps entirely relevant, but one thing I have noticed in my survey of mother-child relationships is that sons tend to really resent it when a mother fails to give them what they believe to be their due, that they do not forgive. Whereas daughters, a remarkable number of daughters who are quite neglected, such as Queen Victoria, forgives her mother, becomes intensely close to her mother, loves her mother, falls apart completely when her mother dies. You will all quote all kinds of different examples to me, but sons, I think, expect certain things from their mother. And when they don't get it, and they see around them that all the other sons are getting it, because mothers were supposed to love all children, but they were actually supposed to be particularly caring of their male children. Male children were given primacy within the family in the 19th century. This is a fact. And so boys who were not given that primacy bore a burden of resentment and bitterness. Now, of course, Mrs. Eddy's son was intensely manipulated. And again, the fact that he couldn't read, and this is so important. I feel for him. And Lord knows one feels for what he experienced as a child. His child was abused. This young man was abused. It's not surprising he turned out the way he did. But it wasn't actually her fault. And it's against her that bitterness is expressed. And I do think there's a moral responsibility there. I can't take him off the hook on that, especially given his mother's situation in life. And the fact that he is so, one thing we never discussed, we were going to talk about women and money, and how all of these women had to learn to deal with money. Mrs. Eddy dealt with money in a very remarkable way. She had such a smart view of it. She was able to use it and not depend on it. He didn't inherit that from her. He inherited something from his father, who died insolvent, as we know. He was a gambler. He was a male. And so he needed money. He needed money. And I have to judge him for the decisions that he made.
Yeah, it's interesting how she could relate to businessmen, like her letters with Kimball and her letters with other men, where you get a feeling of, they're shoulder to shoulder, or Farlow or something.
Yes.
Yes. And it's very different. She's right out there with them. They're really partners on the edge.
And of course, this is the area, I say this in my book, that Mark Twain could forgive Mrs. Eddy for many things except for making money and keeping it. I mean, this is the, and how can you be a religious woman and be able to, keep hold on things? This is inconceivable in a saint or a religious leader, a female religious leader, in Mark Twain's eyes. Joan of Arc did not manage money well.
But you see, Eddy was a Yankee.
Well, thank you so much, Gillian, and thank you all for being here with us tonight.
I should be thanking Jonathan for doing such a beautiful job.
Well, we're going to look forward to your next work, Gillian, come when it may, and I'm sure it'll come at just the right time, as all your other works have. Gillian has kindly agreed to sign any books that people may have. I believe we have some for purchase of her newest book, We Too. So that is an activity that will take place here in the atrium. And I, again, just want to repeat how happy we are that you've been with us tonight, and we look forward to seeing you again at our next event. And keep in mind the web forum that we're going to be having on Thursday, April 8th. So if there are any questions that come to you on your drive home, you think, oh my gosh, why didn't I ask her that? You'll have another opportunity on the 8th of April to email that question in. Well, thank you again.